Welcome, everybody, to the Office of Undergraduate Research Education Series. Today's session is on writing in STEM. And this is a virtual event. It's being recorded. So we ask everyone to mute yourself and turn off your camera to ensure the best experience. And if you have questions, please use the chat feature, or you can unmute yourself when you're invited by the speaker. And this is the event evaluation. We'd love everyone to complete this after the session, but we want to remind the Europe, Wilkes, and honors thesis scholars that you must complete this in order to get credit for attending today. And the mission of the Office of Undergraduate Research is to facilitate and promote undergraduate, student, faculty, collaborative research and creative works in all disciplines throughout the U campus. And we would like to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The U recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribe states and the federal government, and we affirm the U's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker today. It's Dr. Maureen Mathison. She's an associate professor in writing and rhetoric.
I am Dr. Maureen Mathison, and welcome. I am here today to talk to you about writing in STEM. My background in teaching writing and researching is in STEM, and so I'm here today to talk to you about what we know about best practices for writing in STEM. And I have here my email, so if you'd like to take that down, I would be happy to meet with anybody if you have further questions, or if you want to send me an email after this and I can help, I'm happy to do that. So the first thing that I want to do is actually talk about the word author and writer, because I think oftentimes we don't think of ourselves as authors or writers, but when we write, but there's a connection between the word author and authority. And what that means is somebody has the knowledge and the ability to take action, which is what you do when you practice science. An author is a person who writes about something about which they are knowledgeable, and that is you. You are learning, right? You, as students, are learning to take on more authority as you're enculturated into your major. And I think the main thing to remember is that over time, you're going to improve, because the more you are exposed to your discipline, the more you will have a better sense of how to engage your readers, to communicate with them. And I think it's also important to remember that you are being socialized into your major. So that doesn't mean it happens immediately. It means, again, that over time you're going to understand kind of like what the jargon means, how to talk, how to write, all of these things. I recently read an article that I think is really important for students to understand. Someone interviewed faculty at a research institution and wrote an article about it. And one of the things that some of the faculty said, and I think this is in particular from a physics faculty member, argumentation is one of the major enculturation leaps faculty expect students to make. Students should assert a claim and develop that claim through its conclusions. What that means is that faculty want you to take on that authority, to be able to read and critique information, to be able to take lots of information and synthesize it, to analyze it, synthesize it, and for you to feel confident to be able to say, well, so and so said this, but I think it would be better if we did this, right? And I've noticed that even as I teach students, I teach a science writing class, is the idea that because it's in writing, people are very hesitant to actually critique someone else's work because they're considered experts since it's published. But that's the way new knowledge is made, is that we have to actually say, oh my gosh, I can think of a different way to do this that might be better. Otherwise, if we didn't do that, we'd still be living in caves. So I think a big message from this is to take some risks and kind of grow your confidence in engaging with other people's work. So this might seem like a strange thing to start out with, but what is writing? So many people think of it as grammar and syntax, and oh, I have to get everything correct. The truth is, it's a lot more than that. Writing is a form of thinking, right? If because you're writing about something. If you have an idea and you can't write about it, right? You can't really, your reader's not going to understand. So it really is a way of thinking about what you want someone to know, and that is your reader. It's also a way to demonstrate your knowledge because part of writing, and some of you have mentioned this in your questions that you submitted, is about having credibility. You want to come across as credible. And so writing is a way to demonstrate your knowledge. But more than that, your 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 level of knowledge, I think, helps with your credibility. And writing is also a way to share your knowledge. And again, we do the work we do because we want to improve things. And the way to do that is to share the information and the knowledge that we have. The other thing I think that we don't think about is that writing takes many, many forms, and we call those forms genres. And I think this is part of a key to understanding some of the best ways to think about writing and to engage your reader. So, what is quality writing? It's quality thinking. So, not just regurgitating information unless you're asked to, right? It's about analyzing it and synthesizing it. It's a command of the subject matter. So, I think it is reading broadly and reading deeply. And it's the ability to communicate knowledge and claims in the appropriate form, genre for the context. You know what the word problem solving is probably in your discipline. Writing is no different. It's what we call it's a problem solving task. Oh my gosh, I have to submit a report. What do I need to do? Right? What do I do first? What do I do second? How do I think about this? So I think some of the practices that you've learned in your own fields can help you with writing if you start to think of writing as a problem-solving task. Is bad academic writing bad science? Well, bad science does not necessarily mean poor research design or ill thought out variables. Here, bad science means irrational, illogical, incomprehensible, open to misinterpretation, unclear, imprecise, vague, and hence perhaps irreproducible. So you already are familiar with a lot of these things. This idea of being precise, um, being irrational in science, and in well, STEM particularly, many disciplines, all disciplines actually, have a certain kind of logic. And the community that you're being socialized into has particular practices that you need to follow in order to do well, to be considered a quality scientist or a quality engineer, quality architect, geologist, whatever. And so we do know that if you look at all of this, bad science is kind of like bad writing. It's not well thought out. it's not clear. When someone reads it, they don't really know what your point is. And so I think that you have to have this in your writing because it will influence your ideas and how they will be received. And we're really talking about, when we talk about your writing and how it will be received, what we're really talking about is how your knowledge, the logic you're using to put that knowledge to use, and the claims that you're making, right? So, good writing will get your knowledge, your logic, and your claims across without people being confused. So, we talked about genres before. And when we talk about writing, a lot of times people think it's static, that it's just something on the page, right? I use my computer, I type, right? And there it is. That's not true. I think writing is about when you write, you are actually creating a world for somebody else to inhabit. They don't just read the words. As they're reading those words, they are imagining what you're trying to get across. And so genres are a way for people to understand what you're trying to get them to think about or to change or in some way alter behavior, right? So a genre is what we call a recurring form that is appropriate for a context, and that context is specific, right? So it's not like, so when somebody asks you to write a research report, what do you think they're asking you to do? They're really asking you, again, not just to put words on paper, but to actually write up what you know and what you want to tell them, right? That's different from, say, a lab notebook, which most of the time you write for yourself. Um, so those have very different purposes. And what we call them, I guess, we call them recurring because whenever you write in your notebook, it's going to take a certain form. Whenever you write a research report, it's going to take a certain form, or a resume takes a certain form. Why? Because you're meeting the reader's expectations, right? If it's off, right? If you and you may have gotten comments on papers before where someone will say something like, I'm not quite sure what you're doing here, or I don't understand this, right? If it's off, it means that your message isn't coming through. Part of it could be that you're not fulfilling the expectations of the genre. And so I want to take that a little further to make this more real. I want you to think about the kind of movies that you really like, right? So if you have a certain kind of movie that you really like, what about an action movie, right? What about an action film? What do you expect in an action film? What kind of music is there, right? There's kind of this edgy music to put people kind of on the edge of their seat. It's not, you're not going to hear violins, probably. You're not going to hear music that's soft, right? You're going to hear music that kind of propels you to expect something, but with kind of an edge because you know there's going to be danger in there. What is the dialogue about? How do they talk? Like they're not going to talk about things that might be in, say, a romance film, right? Because that doesn't fit with the genre. They're going to be dressed in certain ways. They have different kinds of roles. And so if you go into a movie theater and you're expecting to go watch an action film and you walk in and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is weird because what I'm seeing is that this actually looks like a comedy. They're telling jokes. The way the plot is set up is different. And after about not even 5 minutes, you're pretty aware that this is not what you had in mind. So when you think about what you're being asked to write, your reader expects certain certain kinds of things. So the lab report's different, the um, the notebook is different, the lab book is different, all of these are different. So here's some of the things that here's some of the genres that you all write. And why are these important? They are what, like, we don't write laboratory reports in writing. We don't write conference abstracts either. That's unique to STEM. We don't do well, sometimes we do poster presentations, but not very often. But when you think about each of these, none of these is similar, right? I mean, they all have a different purpose. What's the purpose of a lab notebook? One is to make sure that you keep a record of what you do. But two, the purpose even goes beyond that. Lab notebooks have been used in congressional hearings to see if somebody committed fraud. Lab notebooks have been used in fights over who discovered something. So when we talk about what these things do, they actually are action oriented because they're used socially as well. A memo, what does a memo do? And you might not be writing memos right now, but maybe you do write emails. Emails were based on memos. So that's inner office, a lot of times inner office communication. What does a grant proposal do? Right? It's very different from, say, a literature review, even though the literature review is part of a grant proposal. So a grant proposal, or just like the proposal that you might write to do Europe, right? What you're doing is you're proposing an idea and you're showing that you can follow through on it. So I'm not talking about necessarily what goes into it. What you're hearing me talk about is what they're doing, right? Text do something. The bio sketch, the first time I saw a bio sketch, somebody asking for a bio sketch, I was really confused. I'm like, what's a bio sketch? It's a different kind of way of saying kind of what your experience is from a STEM perspective. So all of these have different purposes. So when we talk about a purpose of a document, we're really talking about what you want somebody who reads it to think about or to do, right? To set something in motion. And they change. I think this is important, again, because it's the idea that writing isn't about necessarily perfection, although I think there are certain standards, and we can talk about those, and we will. But I want you to read this. Take a minute. Isaac Newton, who is considered just a phenomenal scientist, look at how he was writing in 1671. This is a scientific report, by the way. I want you to notice some of the things that now when we look at that, we think, wow, that's odd. We don't write like that anymore in STEM. I procured a triangular glass prism. Some of it is the English that they used, but also notice, having darkened my chamber and made a small hole in the window shuts to let in a convenient quantity of the sun's light. Wow. Today we might be more precise, right? And say how much light. At first, a very pleasing diversion, right? Look at that, pleasing diversion. We do not say that to my view. In other words, he really thought it was cool. After a while, applying myself to consider more circumspectly. So after I actually thought this was cool, I started to think about it, right? My first reaction was, wow. So you will see that comparing the length of this colored spectrum with its breadth, I found it about 5 times greater. Now, it excited me to a more than ordinary curiosity of examining from whence it might proceed. we don't write like this anymore. What are some of the things that we don't do or that we do, right? And so this idea that things change, they do. We don't use adverbs or adjectives. We don't talk about how cool we think something is. Just the fact that we're writing about it means that we really think this is an engaging topic. If we use numbers, they're really precise. We don't say that it was a, I found it about 5 times greater. We don't say that anymore, right? That wouldn't fly. I mean, how he is writing then would not be published today in a scientific journal. The key, though, is to understand that the way that you write now in your field is likely going to change in your lifetime, I think, and probably with AI, it will, right? But for example, now I think with research articles in a lot of in many STEM journals, they no longer have the methods section, which I find disturbing because what does the methods section do? It it lets people know if your claims follow from what you did, right? So now what they're doing is putting the method sections online, and the rest of the journal is published. So it's changing according to, I think, social needs and what the community that you're in requires. So here's some features of STEM writing. Write for purpose, right? Be familiar with the genre and organize appropriately. Use headings. Headings are great. Headings, I even tell students to use headings to keep them like writing what they need to in a certain section. And then maybe when they're done with that section, if it's not part of a genre, they can get rid of that heading. But clearly, right, when you're writing, it helps to say, for example, in a lab report, what is the experiment? Why is it important? What are the materials and the quantity of materials? And that's important too. In talking to a chemistry professor at one time, he was saying that this was critical to have the precise amount of the chemicals that you need. And I said, well, of course, because when you do the experiment, you have to have the chemicals that you need. And he said, well, yeah, but not only that. He said, we don't want to throw out chemicals because it's environmentally bad. And so I think some of the things sometimes that we think are just, oh, that has to be there. There's a reason that those things are there, because they help you be better at what you're doing while minimizing, for example, in chemistry harm. Um, so that's important. And you want to include relevant information. And I think that's where headings really are important in your literature review when you first start out, right? Um, what are you doing? And I'll get to this in a little bit. Right? For clarity, I don't think Newton was very clear, right? Um, he wasn't really direct. It was kind of a narrative about how he, set up his experiment. But it kind of took a while to get through that. And when he said it was about 5 times greater, today that we need to be precise. If you're doing something, you use X amount or you did this amount, right? So you want to be direct and to the point, and you want to eliminate or minimize adverbs and adjectives. We don't talk about something being beautiful or spectacular, right? Um, we just have kind of here is the information. You do want to write for precision. Be exact with procedures and numbers. It's interesting because I'm teaching a writing class in science right now, and the lab reports just came in. And I had to, for a lot of people who sometimes were juniors and seniors, say, no, you have to say exactly how much you need for materials. And that's a separate section, right? It's not just one long paper. A lab report has very different sections. And you have to have your materials, and your materials go before procedure. And procedure is stepwise, right? So you want to be able to give people directions on how to do this. But at the same time, the other part of that is, are you credible? Right? Writing is also about credibility. Is what you did in the order you did it credible? Um, should I trust your methods? And you want to write for novelty. Everything that we do in actually in the world, right? We're looking for new ways to improve the quality of life. And so this idea of novelty is important. So be aware, right, of how your work contributes something new, no matter how big or small. I think oftentimes when we're starting out, we think, oh, I want to do something big. I mean, I did this too. And then what I realized is that there are so many people working on the same project that anything new that we can contribute, whether it's on a grand scale or a small scale, right, is important. If you think about one step forward, though sometimes we take baby steps to move forward, sometimes somebody comes along and it's a big leap, but we can't get anywhere even without baby steps. So think about, how am I contributing to this problem? Um, and how can I let people know that in my writing, right? So that's also important. And I think we have a problem with that, because that's saying that you're contributing something new is taking on more authority, right? It's saying, I have enough knowledge, and I know how to set up what I need to do to make some claims that will move us forward. That's confidence. STEM writing tells a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I want to talk about different parts of, and I'm happy to take questions afterward about other kinds of writing, but for the moment, right? Um, I want to talk about some things that I think might help you think about your writing. First, you must show how your idea fits into a larger group of researchers in your field, no matter what your field is. Even in writing, I do this, you know, because what we're doing is we're part of a conversation about a problem. And who else is having that conversation with us? In other words, I always tell people your literature review does a couple things. One, it shows who is doing similar work to you. Um, and I call this the group of people I'd like to have lunch with. But it also shows what hasn't been done. Because when we talk about when you're going to contribute something new to the thinking in your field, to this problem, you have to know what's been done before. So you want to read pretty and critique, right? This is also part of it. So as you're reading, you're thinking, oh, so this is the problem. This is how they're setting it up. This is how their methods to and when I say methods, it can be quantitative, it can be qualitative, it can be theoretical, right? You're looking for the logics that they've put in place to answer their question. And all research starts with a question. So, what question are they trying to answer? And what literature is related to that? So, does the reader, or does, and so here's what, so you have to show the idea fits into a larger group of researchers. The reader, as they read your, right, because you've presented something, the reader will read and say, oh, does the writer understand the problem and what's been done to solve it so far? Who has tried to address different parts of the problem? And where is the gap in knowledge, right? What can I do that will further this to move it along? So that gap, you're not just reading to say, oh, that's cool, that's cool. Oh yeah, they did this, but you're also reading to say, What could they have done differently that nobody's done, right? Here, so I have 10 people. They've all done this, but oh my gosh, they're still part of this problem that I think I can take on, that I can address. I figured out where the gap is. There's a hole there. Let's go ahead and fill that hole. That's me, right? You must be exact in your methods. And you probably are told this. And the easiest analogy is it's like a recipe, right? For replication. If you've ever tried to cook something for the first time that's really a difficult meal, right? And you don't follow the recipe, it can be a disaster. And so you want to be very exact. And why? Because your reader, as they're reading, this is what they're thinking. Does the writer understand the best way to solve the problem? Has the writer designed a logical and stepwise way to solve it? Can I follow it? Is it clear? And so we always think about replication. I got to be honest, most research is not replicated outside the lab that it came from. Why? Because it's too expensive. And so it's expensive, and other people are doing other things too. But so it's really important for your methods to be clear because again, this is also when we say, is this the best way to solve the problem? I actually have reviewed articles, and when I look at it, it's like, here's the problem. This is how they try to answer it. And it's like, this is not, and then here's what they end up with. It's like, this doesn't fit, right? So it is also about um, making sure that your methods not just to replicate, but actually it's about people evaluating the way you went about the study. You must explain visuals and numbers. They don't speak for themselves. Time and time again, and this is important, um, because you know what a number means because you did the research, but somebody on that numbers are numbers. They're symbol systems. It's like if you give me a word without a context, that word has no meaning, right? A number is going to indicate something to somebody, but you have to tell them what. It's tied to your research question and the problem that you're trying to solve. So the reader, right, will say, well, as they're reading, will think, what does the writer want me to understand about the numbers? What do the numbers mean in the context the writer has set up in the literature, right, where you're setting up the problem as the gap? Right? So when you have a number and you have like a table on a chart, right? You always need to have in writing a description of those numbers and what you want you want to direct the reader, right? You really want to direct the reader to what those numbers mean. How do they support what you're going to claim? Because if you just put the numbers there, somebody's looking at your table or they're looking at your, your graph, and they're like, why, what am I supposed to get from this? Part of this is, again, you're telling the story. A number is part of that story. And the same with visuals. When you have a visual, and there's a lot of kinds of visuals, what do you want me to focus on? Because there's so much going on in visuals, even, with, well, I think so. What do you want me to direct my attention to? What do you want me to examine? Because that visual also, when I look at the visual, I'm also going to go to the numbers, right? If they're in the same thing. And I will tell you that one of the first things that scientists do when they read an article is they first look at the conclusion to see if they think it's a good claim. Then they go up to the abstract to see if it's relevant to their research, totally. And then they look at the visuals and the numbers, and then they read, right? So you want to tell what they need to see what that story means. What is the story of your numbers and your visuals? What do you want them to take from that? I also think, and I that research is kind of like a detective story, right? Um, you're setting up the scene, right? Setting up the crime is kind of like the literature review. Here's the problem. Um, so if you think of yourself as a detective, and here's and the way this came about was um, I was talking to a STEM professor, and uh, they were saying, you know, students have a really hard time at the end of research figuring out what something means. And they just kind of summarize what they found instead of interpret it. So if you think of research as a crime scene, think of a detective who is called to a robbery. And the detective goes in and sees that the drawer is open, that cash has been taken, that somebody has dropped a glove, or that they left the back door ajar. What does that detective do? Those are clues, right? Those are clues because we don't know what the end result is yet. Those are clues that that detective has to figure out. So they took the cash, they dropped a glove, the back door is ajar. What does this mean? Okay, so it is a robbery. There might be DNA that we can have tested, and the back door is ajar. So maybe there was a car in the back, right, that was waiting for somebody. They escaped maybe through the back door. So they're not as likely to be seen. These are clues. So there's not a lot to go on at this point, but they have to figure out what those clues mean in order to solve the crime. So if we think about clues as variables, right? In the end, you have to think about, I got these numbers, um, and what do they mean? They're very, like you had certain things that you were testing. And so it's almost like a detective where you have to go in and you have to interpret. That empty cash drawer is not going to tell you who did it. That the door that is ajar is not going to tell you who did it, or the glove is not going to tell you who did it, right? You're going to have to figure out what that means, and that means interpret, not summarize. You have to interpret, right? So here's why this is kind of a story. The literature review is setting the scene, right? Is it a robbery? Is it a murder? Is it a hit and run? Whatever, right? The approach to solving the crime, what methods are you going to use, right? How are you going to set this up to figure out what your problem, right? The answer to your problem. And the results are who done it, right? So you come up with numbers, you come up with a certain visual, you come up with whatever indicates a result in your field. Then you have to figure out what does it mean, right? That's the discussion and conclusion. What does it mean? You have to go back to your literature review, right? You have to tie it back to that. If other people have said these things about this problem, I found this. So what could that mean? And looking at my methods and my results, right? The way that you interpret is to say, how does this fill that gap? How does it actually solve the crime, right? What is the setting for it? Does that, I don't know if that makes sense, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But the main thing is that you have to interpret. You're not summarizing. You have to go back like a detective does to figure out what the clues mean. And oftentimes, the way you've set up your experiment or the way you're going about answering the problem are the clues that will give you an answer. I have a lot of questions from people, right? Are you going to write in first person or third? That's a very good question. This is one of those cases where STEM writing is changing. I would say to be safe to begin with, people usually write in the third person, but it clearly is shifting, and people are using first person and also we, right? So if it's a team, I'm seeing more people using we, and we are seeing more first person as well. If this is for a class, I would ask the professor. I think one of the things I think, and I did a research study, and I looked at four different professors looking at the same papers, and each professor wanted something different, right? So one of the things I tell my students is always ask your professor, not like, what do I need to do to get a good grade? But, right, I think a good question is, you know, what are some of the things that you think would help me be the best writer that I can for this assignment? Right? In other words, it's putting it back on you, not like I just want a good grade, but I really want to do well on this. Or just ask your question specifically to the professor. So I would say it's shifting. And that's a question. If you're doing it for a class, I would ask the professor what they prefer. Um, Also, you can look at journal articles. I think journal articles are some of the best models for writing. How are people writing today? How long should an abstract be? Usually, abstracts are about 150 to 200 words, right? So they're not that long. They're short. Well, they're a little longer in STEM sometimes, because you want to present the problem, you want to present the methods, and then your conclusion. What claim are you going to say what did you find, right? That's a claim. What did I find? It's a claim. Is AI acceptable in STEM? If so, what is the ethical way to use it? That is the big question today. I can tell you it is and it isn't, right? So there are some journals in STEM that will say you cannot do anything. We will not publish anything that has used AI, right? So there are journals out there that will say no AI. There are other journals now that will say if you use AI, you must tell us where, although people are not, right? So that's really not ethical. That's kind of like saying, now you will see in journals if someone has a conflict of interest, like if somebody is doing research on something and they're also being paid by a company for which this research is really important, there could be a conflict of interest. That needs to be stated now in articles that I currently am a consultant for this company, right? So it's the same with AI. You cannot use AI as an author. You cannot use AI in the citations at all. No, I don't think I can tell you this, and it drives me nuts. Some, and again, I'm saying this from my class. I think AI is okay to use in certain circumstances. What I'm seeing is that students, again, in my science writing class, I can tell the students who are using only AI and the students who may have used AI but are also using their own writing with AI. The students who are only using AI are getting worse grades, not because the writing is technically, again, right? When we said writing is about thinking, it's not that it's not written badly. It's written great, right? If it was like spelling 100%, syntax 100%, all of this, there's not enough detail. It's too bland. When we talk about precision, when we talk about exactness, it's not there with AI. Okay. I went to a conference this summer and there was an electrical engineer from the University of Minnesota, and he was talking about having his students use AI in he had an assignment where he told students to use AI. And the interesting thing was, and I think this is a lesson, is that the students who were better writers did better with AI than the students who were not as good a writer. So for me, kind of the moral of that story is that AI is a tool that can help you, but you are the writer, right? So people are using AI, but then they actually use their own writing skills to actually help AI, right? AI is not we know this. AI is not great right now. It might take a year or two, we don't know, but um, the ethical way to use it is to actually say that you've used it. And definitely, and I think there's also, you know, the ethical part of that is if you're doing research and you're using AI, and that research actually ends up being some kind of a medical device or something. I actually, as a person who might use that medical device, want to know if AI had a part in that. That's also ethical because the consequences of that are important. There is some research coming out now that is actually, I read this recently, that some surgeries have gone wrong because AI was used and was not able to locate certain organs. So it's not perfect right now, and I think you need to be aware of that. So don't rely on it totally. Sometimes I feel that I have a hard time getting my point across clearly and effectively sharing information. How can I improve? I would actually have to see what might be getting in the way of clarity. I'm not sure exactly what that means. At this point, I would say, there are genres. You can look that up. Actually, that's a use of AI. How is this genre written? That would be a use of AI, is to figure that out. Um, but getting a point across clearly, I'm not sure what kind of a point, what kind of data would be used. So the genre is important. And then also just including relevant information. And here's the other thing that we haven't talked about, revising. Revising is so important. Somebody said the definition of writing is revising. And I know nobody who ever publishes, like you think all your professors like know everything, but guess what? When they submit an article for publication, it's not always accepted right away. Most articles are called revise and resubmit. Our work in any discipline goes out to readers, and those readers do exactly kind of what I've been talking about. They're asking questions of the problem, the literature they're using, where the gap is, how those methods actually help to answer that question and move the problem along. And they come back and they always have suggestions for us to improve our writing. So nobody, and then we have to go back to what we thought was a good article and say, okay, I have to, my readers, my readers, right, will need more information about this according to my reviewers or this. So I would say have somebody, two things. One, read your document out loud, because sometimes we can hear things when we read our own work out loud. And second of all, maybe give your document, your text to somebody else to read as a reviewer and see where the point is not coming across. So rely on other people and rely on yourself. Whoops. Tips for creating an effective poster. It's kind of IMRAD, the introduction, the results, or the methods, the results, and there are some, well, first of all, I think undergraduate studies has had, if you're going to do if you're going to be in one of the conferences that they actually have, I think, a session on posters where you can, and they used to have I think, a site on the website about creating a good poster. Um,
Yes, we do.
yes, okay,
Mhm.
good. So I think that would be the first place I would go. Um, but an effective poster, again, is going to follow that yeah, introduction. What is the problem? Two, what methods did I use to solve it? Three, what were my results? Four, what do I want to claim? Right? What do those results mean? And then also to use visuals or tables, figures or tables help. You don't want, you want to watch for the colors that you use. You don't want to overwhelm the poster with colors, although visuals can be very nice to kind of illustrate what you're doing. But I would definitely go to undergraduate studies for that. What are good strategies for breaking down the task of writing large works like a research publication? Um, I think one of the things I would do is I always start with headings. And one of the easiest things for me, you have to figure out, I think everybody is different. I would say, what is the easiest thing for you to write? For me, it's my method section. So whenever I start to write something, I always start with my method section. And then I might go, but headings are really important, like introduction, methods, and then within methods, right, the methods would be who are the participants, if there are participants, what are the materials, what is the procedure, and then I would say I would obviously the last thing you would do would be the discussion and the conclusion. So I would say breaking it down would be breaking it down into those headings and seeing where you're most comfortable starting. But I think methods is, for me at least, the best place to start because it gets me writing. And then I usually go up and do the problem statement and the literature review, um, or the results, right? So I would say that. I would also say sometimes what I do is because I think writing, it's not like we start and then we move all the way through. Sometimes if I get tired of writing one section, I move to the other section, right? And start to write. And I know that when I write, I'm going to have to revise. So sometimes I'll just start writing ideas, right? I'm tired of writing this method section. I'm going to go up to my literature review and just start brainstorming, like, how to do this. The right journals for publications, not open journals right now. Okay, so the right journal is what do you read? I would say, where are you getting your information, right? So what journals do you tend to read and use? So when you read an article and you love this author, you're like, wow, this is great. What journal was that published in? That's one way to do that. I think open journals right now are questionable because there are a lot of shady open journals. Um, and I think you need to be aware of that. And sometimes even the big companies that publish in STEM have open journals that have been discredited. It's better to publish with a journal with a fee. And they're so expensive. And so when you write a grant, you always want to make sure that you put in your budget the amount that you need to publish in a journal. And I don't know how much that is now. A few years ago, it was like $1,000. It might be getting cheaper because a lot of journals are only online. But an open journal, you have to be very careful. And even if it's a reputable publisher, you still want to be careful. I don't want to say what publisher it was, but I think recently there were like a dozen of their journals that were open access and they were discredited. So you just want to be very careful. Also, I think another way to think about it is to talk to your peers. you know, talk to professors, talk to peers in the workplace, or if you're going on for a master's, and you'll learn this. But you can ask people for help. Tips for finding people to review my writing in the future post graduation. That's a good question. I think if you have people that you're still friends with in your major, that might be a way to have somebody read something. I think that if you're in the workplace, there will be people who will review your writing there. Um, I don't know the context for this. Are you going to try to publish, or are you working for an organization? Um, and this is something to keep in mind too, that there are technical editors who are very good and that work freelance. So if you go to, I mean, you can even Google this, is technical editors, freelancers. You can find people who are very happy to help for a fee, right? But again, just I think you can use yourself reading out loud and maybe some of your peers if you remain friends with them and your people within your organization. And then again, I think technical editors. What is the very best way to effectively communicate difficult to understand research? Try to make it as simple as possible. And who are you writing for? If you're writing for um, other STEM people in your field, you still want to be very considerate of them. And I think sometimes it helps to take very difficult concepts and to break them down. We have noticed that sometimes using a metaphor, like I'm trying to think of, okay, in AI, I mean, big metaphor was, or in cognitive psychology was like, the brain is like a computer, right? It's really difficult to explain how the brain works, but if you think about the brain as a computer, you can think about how it files things, right? How it can retrieve things. Um, you can talk about different aspects that if you think about a computer, it will help you understand the brain. So metaphors can work. Um, just like your professors sometimes, and I just said it, that, writing in STEM is telling a story. Well, that's a metaphor, right? Because writing in STEM is really not a story as we think of it, but it helps us to understand something that's really complex in a different way, which makes it easier. I think sometimes to break down, if jargon is important, you need to use it. Big words, not so much, right? I think that sometimes we try to sound more intelligent by elevating our writing, and that's really not necessary because the big words are not what makes somebody think of you highly. Again, it's your logic, it's the way you set up your problem, the way you approached it. Um, it's your thinking. And so I think you don't want your writing to get in the way of your thinking. And again, I think you're going to have to revise. I know when I write about, if I'm writing about really difficult concepts, it takes me longer to write something because I have to revise it multiple times to make sure that something is uh, is communicated. And I think kind of like the question above that, give it to someone to read. It's usability. We do this all the time, right? If you're working on a web design, you do usability studies. I think a peer review for writing is the same kind of thing. How accessible, one is you ask people how accessible is this website to navigate, right? So think about your research, right, as almost like a usability testing for a website. Give it to somebody and say, how accessible is my paper, right? And then what tone of voice should be taken? Academic. I think academic. If you're writing for your peers in your community, it can be an academic or whatever your organization requires. Sometimes organizations will have what we call a style guide that will tell you the kinds of things that you need to be aware of. But also, um, if you're writing for the public, you want to you want a voice that connects with the public. So I think people now have, and increasingly now have, kind of two ways to think about the way they communicate. One is communicating with their peers. Who are the people that you work with or who you want to read your research? And then the other is the public, because the public is more and more, and I think you've seen this, the public is more and more vocal about science. And so I think that that tone with the public has to be to treat them as not to talk down to them, because I think a lot of times people will say, or I've heard STEM people say, and this is in the reading, is like people that, oh, they just don't understand. The so there's two things. One, we need to make them understand. But second of all, we need to understand the consequences of our work, because somebody might say, I understand, I just don't like what you're doing. And that's a different kind of argument. And that's not deficit, right? It's not like they don't understand science, because not all science is seen in the same light. And so if you really think about what, if I put this out into the world, how is it going to affect people? That's what people also want to know, not just whether or not they understand the science, but do they understand, for example, the repercussions of this? And I think that we're seeing a lot of this right now, particularly in health and human services, with some of the questions now that people have about vaccines. And so imagine that you are pro or anti-vaccine and that you're trying to talk to somebody who has the opposite view of you. No matter what you say in terms of the research, right? That may not convince them. So you have to start thinking about ways to get people thinking about what your creation, your invention, whatever is going to do in their world, right? And so I think we have to start thinking about tone differently. One is, I think this idea of, yes, I'm writing for my community, whether it's architecture or civil engineering or whatever. And then the other is that you're going to have one, the public, because the public is hearing much more about STEM. And then another thing also, I think, would be like communicating with the public, the news, the media. That's another thing too. And I think that, so to say what tone of voice, I think again will depend on what you're writing and who you're writing for. So here are some campus resources. You have the University Writing Center. When I say free, it's part of your, I think you already pay fees for these. They have people there who actually are in STEM who will review your papers. And there's the link, University Career Success, career coaching. They can help you with your resume, with your cover letters. If you're looking for a job, you should go there. And then the Department of Writing and Rhetoric Studies, we have writing 3014 writing in science, which is offered every semester. So I hope this helps. If you have further questions, I think I hope you wrote down my email address. You can find me anyway if you just Google the Department of Writing and Rhetoric Studies. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks.
I just want to remind everybody about the evaluation form. We just want to remind everybody about the Office of Undergraduate Research. We're in the SIL Center, and our website is our.utah.edu. And thank you again, Dr. Mathison. We appreciate
Oh,
this.
you're welcome. And if anybody wants to reach out for whatever reason, let me know.